This box is the juxtaposition of man-made materials sculpted into more organic natural forms and natural materials formed into flat shapes. At least that's the story I'd be telling you if this was an entirely original idea. I saw French designers Ben and Manu posting something like this on Instagram in their Instagram stories. I don't have a direct link to it because it was just their stories. And I thought, you know what, I have to have a go at doing something like this. There is a lovely contrast between the plywood, pine plywood at that, sculpted into these more organic forms. It has something that's very touchable about it. And then the hardwood on top is just a pretty flat top. And it just looks so touchable. In this video, we'll be going through how to sculpt something like this. It's a lot easier than you might think. This is just a very basic mitered box made out of plywood. The actual box construction isn't particularly interesting or important. I'm going for continuous grain, which is why I'm flip-flopping the workpiece as I'm cutting. A shallow dado was cut into all pieces to accept a panel, which was just an offcut from my scraps bin. Gluing up solid wood miters needs reinforcement, but plywood is strong enough with just butt joints. Glue is put on all miters and blue tape holds the whole lot together. Blue tape is usually sufficient, but as I have some band clamps, I may as well use them. After the glue up, I bet you're thinking, wow, that's some lovely continuous grain on the pine plywood box. Why would you do that? In all honesty, it doesn't really matter, but as we're revealing the extra layers of grain by carving it, it'll be a little bit easier to match up all the patterns with the depth if all the grains are going the same way or the layers are going the same way. So these will be relatively continuous all the way around at any depth, so it should just be a lot easier to carve even if the net result looks exactly the same. Ultimately it means just a little bit more wasted wood, but it's plywood, cheap plywood, and it's not really that much extra that gets wasted. The next step now is, while it's still nice and square, make a lid for it. I'm just going to go for a simple rebated lid that'll just drop in friction fit. There are dozens of ways to cut a rebate on a lid like this. I went for the table saw with just my regular blade rather than changing to a flat tooth grind blade or a dado blade, because by the time I'd got all of that set up, I'll already be done, so it didn't make a lot of sense to switch. The downside of using my regular blade is it leaves quite the bat wings, as it's not a flat tooth grind blade. So I need to clean that up with some hand tools. For the short grain on the end, I'm just going to use the chisel, as that's going to go through that quite quickly. For the long grain, I'll use either a rabating block plane or a shoulder plane. This shoulder plane is pretty okay. It's not great, and it's certainly not the sharpest tool I've got at the moment, so I may not use this. That's the lid fitted. It's not a piston fit, but it'll do nicely for this. The lid will expand while the box probably won't, because it's plywood, so I don't want that too snug, otherwise I'll never be able to get it off when it expands. I've struck a line 5mm down from the top on all 4 sides. I've also drawn the centre line on the top, connected that corner at the 5mm down mark to the centre, and that's creating a peak in the middle here. Now I'm going to hand plane off those corners so I actually get that peak. I've already done this side. It's fairly quick to do. You could do it with power tools, but the risk reward probably isn't there. I've got my low angle jack set to a relatively coarse cut, I suppose, for how I normally have it set up, and I'm just going to work my way down on one corner and start to work my way across. I just need to keep checking for that 5mm line to make sure I'm not going past it, and I can start to adjust on the end grain as well to make sure my angle is more correct. Bit of extra wax, as these are getting to full width shavings, should help make it a lot easier. I'll just back the blade out a little bit as I get closer and closer. With it planed on both sides of the peak, I now want to add facets to the end. So I'll have a flat landing here rather than making it a pyramid. So I need to work on this center portion here. I'm switching to a smaller plane. This is my number 4 smoothing plane. The low angle jack would work fine. It's just a little bit long for this type of thing, that it's just a bit uncomfortable. I'm going to start at the far end first and work my way back. Once I've established a nice flat, I can work more towards the sides. Again, I'm using the guideline of the 5mm line down from the top, as well as these 2 lines here that I don't want to cross over for my facet. I'm just going to keep constantly checking that line to make sure I'm not going past it. When I'm marking out for carvings like this, I like to draw a line, and that line is what's going to be left behind. So I'm going to carve away the stuff in between the lines. So I'm drawing out the peaks rather than the valleys. So by that I mean I can draw a squiggle like so, draw another squiggle, and the stuff in between is what's going to be left behind. These lines that continue over the corner will make it seem like it's one sculpture rather than 4 separate sculptures stuck together. At least that's the hope anyway. Before I get started actually carving, let's talk a little bit about the tools that I'll be using to do the carving. I'll be using primarily the Foredom SR, which is a flex shaft tool. Here's the flex shaft. It's a rotary tool, quite similar to a Dremel, just with a flex shaft and a bit more powerful. The SR in particular is great for left-handers because you can reverse the direction of the bit, which means you're not fighting the cutter as it digs into the wood. If you're a left-hander and using a Dremel, you might have experienced quite a few times where the Dremel just wants to run towards you and it's very hard to control. That's because the direction is the wrong way for your handedness. One really nice feature of a Foredom is the foot switch. This controls both turning the machine on and off and the speed by depressing it further or not. This allows me to keep both hands above the workbench, one on the handpiece, one on the workpiece, and it's a lot safer and easier to control when I'm not having to switch things on and juggle everything else. The handpiece I'll be using is the 44T. This came with the Foredom when I bought it. It takes different size collets for different size shank bits. It's very similar to a Dremel in that sense. You can see it's got nice bearings on it, spins nice and freely. I'll primarily be using 2 bits, both with a 1/4 inch shank on them. This one is a 1-inch ball from Kutzall. This is really quite good for removing a lot of material with quite a gentle radius on it as far as small carvings go, and that'll be my roughing out tool. For a little bit more detail, I've got this medium-sized flame bit from Saburtooth Burrs. It's a lovely bit, leaves a reasonably good finish so long as you get the direction right when you're doing the pull strokes. After I use these 2 bits, I'll be refining everything using some sandpaper, perhaps on one of Arbortech's tools. Because of the size and shape of this particular carving, it's actually going to be very safe and very easy to hold it with one hand and do all my cuts with the other. I'm very much a belts and suspended type guy, so if I felt the real need to clamp it, I would, or use the vise that's on this workbench, but really it's fairly safe from that point of view. I'll start by taking fairly light passes between the lines, starting to define my shapes, working all the way around the workpiece. Then I'll come back, swap bits, refine all those shapes, work on one panel at a time. I start with pull strokes towards myself. The cutter wants to go the other direction, so this is very safe. I combine moving my hand and the box to get the curves that I like. Once I've roughed out the details, I switch to the green flame bit and repeat the process, trying to smooth out the layer lines as well as going a little bit deeper. With the shaping done, it's now time to sand it and get it all nice and smooth, and just with any other woodworking, sanding is the worst part of power carving. You're probably all familiar with the band style or drum style sanding thing for Dremels, And you could use that here. The problem with it is these multi-directional sweeps where it can be hard not to redefine all of these shapes that we've just carved into the wood. These can be great for exterior curves, but for interior stuff, particularly the multi-directional stuff, it's just difficult to control without digging in and making more of a mess. Alternatively, there are sanding mops, which are synthetic bristles that you can stack up, sort of like a dado stack of sanding discs. And these are fantastic for fine detail. For larger details like this, they're just a bit slow. There are other flex shaft rotary tool sanding things, but I don't have them. So I'm going to go over to my Arbortech tools, which I think are better suited for this type of sanding. For this scale sanding, there are two from Arbortech that really excel. The first is the contour sander, which is an attachment for a standard angle grinder. What makes this nice is it is actually like a random orbital sander where the disc part is separate from the shaft. Downside to this is it is relatively slow, but it's very good at conforming to the shapes that we've carved in and won't really redefine anything. So this is really good for smoothing things out. Though you can do some mild shaping with it. You can see the flexible pad means that it's going to conform to the shapes that we've carved rather than removing too much of the shape. This is also one of the cheapest Arbortech tools because it's just this shaft section here. You supply your own grinder. The downside is, however, that because the shaft is out like this, you can get into all these nooks and crannies, but it does extend the amount of vibration from the grinder. And apart from that, there's also absolutely no way you could capture dust from it because you'd need a shroud down near here, which then defeats the purpose of being able to get into all the fine points. The next option from Arbortech is the Mini Carver or Mini Grinder. The Mini Carver can use a blade, or you can use sandpaper and turn the speed down so that it is not quite as aggressive. This isn't a separate random orbit action like the contour sander, so it is much more aggressive, so you do need to be a little bit more careful. However, the real advantage of this is it doesn't vibrate anywhere near as much because it's not extending out, and it has dust collection. So this is the tool I'm going to be going for. There are other options, of course. You don't have to go with Arbortech. Foredom do have a right angle grinder, mini grinder attachment for the Foredom that you could use similar sort of discs. There is the Merlin 2 from King Arthur Tools, and there's a bunch of other small 2-inch-ish grinders which are great for this type of task if you can get a flexible pad on them. I'm using Livos Kunos oil here. I find it really excels at hand-rubbed finishes, so it's a lot easier to apply to the uneven surfaces like this than the other finishes in my collection. An oil-based finish really adds that extra bit of colour the carving is craving. This is quite a fun little project and it doesn't really have any meaning or anything like that, but it was fun and I had to do it. It's interesting playing with more commodity construction grade materials. This pine BD ply is not meant for art, but it is interesting and it's very touchable. I did mention that if I used birch, I could get some more detail. The pine has 7 layers for 19mm plywood. Birch has 11, so you don't have to go quite as deep to get more layers. Does it look any better? Yes. I've done a worse job of it, but it's still interesting nonetheless. Dimension-wise, this looks almost right. It's probably a little bit tall and the lid is probably a little bit thick. I really wasn't sure what to go for here. It is sort of a golden ratio, and that's why it almost looks very, very right, but just a little bit too tall to be useful for the overall dimensions. Thanks for watching.